move-in Saturday morning, July 23rd, 2022. I just got on 280 on the stretch out to the Poconos. Embedded into its front grille so that it could drive in the left-hand lane and flash people to get out of the lane so that he can pass them. I saw someone suddenly pull back into the middle lane after a flashing started happening further back. And I was like, well, if that was red and blue, that'd be a cop car, but it's not. It's just like a strobe light flashing. And then up came a black Ford F-150 pickup, looking like any other pickup, except it must have had this LED apparatus in the front grille put in as, I guess, a kit of some sort for that purpose. Perhaps they innovated it themselves. I would be surprised. That kind of stuff, although increasingly easy to do, I suppose is done less and less because of all the zillions of commercial products out there of people trying to make a little bit of money on this nutty idea or that, and someone had the idea of car grill LED flashers. The legality of it seems a little dubious, but I'm sure it's on a state-by-state basis, that kind of thing, that kind of regulation. Can you have lights on your car other than those that are indicated for driving? Well, you certainly can have ones that make you look like other types of emergency vehicles, like police cars and ambulances and fire trucks. So I'm sure there is plenty of regulation surrounding what kinds of flashing lights you can have on your car. So what do I do with that? Drive such as this? Fire up the video and talk to you. You could just as easily be listening to a video as well, you know. I've been doing a lot of that recently, of my discretionary media consumption time. I have been choosing the YouTubes. There's a lot of good stuff I'm discovering. It's that whole niche interest long tail thing. No matter what you're interested in, you can feed a lot of that hunger on YouTube because someone else is interested in it and talking about it. And it's that easy passive consumption. The regression of evolution that my generation brought to the picture because of the advent of television, I would mostly attribute it to. You know, that reading was once criticized too, because, you know, reading for enjoyment, having your head in the book all day, when you could be out in the real world and doing real things, right? So, when not everyone in the population was literate, and they're not even all literate today, but back in the day, when literacy was the exception, when it was the sign of a higher class or something. Yeah, I gotta get out of the left-hand lane. I'm going excessively fast, and the middle lane people just keep speeding up, so I'm not gonna hit 90 or something to pass on the left. If they're playing that game, I'm backing off the gas and getting in the middle lane behind them, settling into a good speed for a road that is 65 mile per hour speed limit. So you get some people out here thinking they're on the Autobahn. Not that the Autobahn is as fast as it used to be. I think they put a speed limit on that. And, my expressions are still from the long, long ago. I'm a child of the 80s. I was really a child of the 70s. Born in 1970 firmly makes me all the way through my, reaching 10 years old, right? Because in 1980, I reached 10 years old. But then it also became 81 and I was still 10. So I catch up with the year. So the 80s began when I went double digit. That's pretty much it. So, people who very much characterize the 70s, well, you're hardly aware enough as a human by 10 years old to consider yourself part of that generation, except maybe what you pick up by media that you consume. I guess that varies a lot for different people, how much you're exposed to different things in life by the time you're, say, 10 years old. But by 11 or so, you're starting to become significantly self-aware. You're an adolescent and you're approaching teenhood. A lot of anger is automatically going to come out. One needs to direct anger as well. So choosing where your anger is directed right in the age of becoming aware, meta-awareness, changes in your body. Yeah, so that, 11-year-old through, well, really that second decade is right into your 20s. So, the 70s, through the 70s, I was, single digit for the most part. And then through the 80s, I was 10 years old to 20 years old. I reached my 20-year-olds while it was still the 80s. It's interesting to think about. So I guess I graduated high school in 88 when I was 18, so that makes sense. So 1989, I was 19. In 1990, I was 20. In the year 2000, I was 30. In the year 2010, I was 40. In the year 2020, I was 50. I am 51 years old now. This year will consist of my 52nd birthday. I should really have shaved to look a little bit nicer. Cut off the split ends as well. I can make myself look a little bit less shaggy. But in the world we're in, how much less shaggy do you really need to get yourself to look? This is an interesting new world. The pandemics. A lot less personal interaction with each other. It's easier to crank up the fear. Ugh. Yeah. Fear and paranoia. It's always easy to trigger that in people. So one of the great goals in life is to, have confidence in one's self, one's place in the world. That's a weird one. One's decisions as you're making them, and then one's ability to learn, to reflect, and to improve. To reflect and learn and improve, right? That's a big point of awareness in our modern culture and society now, at least in science, right? Because we are making our machines able to reflect and learn and improve the next iteration of the process. It's probably going to be quite difficult to let go of the notion that only human beings can have at least even conversational level intelligence. I think that's fairly well been proven. And that the Turing test for artificial intelligence has already been passed, that people have been unable to tell whether they were talking to a human being on the other side or a computer. Now, maybe it needs some more definitions of that, like at all to anyone versus over a prolonged period of time to a number of people. So I think that passing the Turing test is not a black and white thing. It's by degree and with plenty of background exposition required, the conditions under which, the context, such as it were. So context is an interesting thing because context is often what separates human intelligence and sentience and awareness and being. Context is what separates a living being's experience from a machine being's experience. And morality does enter into the question early on in the process, in the same way where scientists experimenting on simple forms of life, like bacteria or nematodes or flatworms, some simple thing. You're doing experiments to, and you're gonna be all right with it because of the simplicity of it, but isn't life? It's the old question of, when you're walking on the grass. You're walking on grass. You're walking on living creatures. Right there's some moral questions. When you're walking on the grass and you accidentally crush an ant, did you do anything wrong? If all life is precious, doesn't that make you as much of a murderer as if it were premeditated and against a human being? What gives one a qualitative difference in value versus the other? These things are not black and white, no matter how much, people trying to create false dichotomies because it helps their argument, right? So you force the reduction of an issue to black and white. And you say, is this right or is this wrong? Yes or no. You can only give a yes or no answer. When people try and reduce you to a yes or a no, they're trying to frame the argument as a dichotomy of this versus that. Either this is true or that is true. You don't have to let yourself be cornered in that way. You can get right into it. You can say there is not a yes or no answer to that question. The answer to that question is full of subtlety and nuance, which do matter. To brush aside the details, to try and reduce this to a black and white issue, is to try and alter the reality of the situation. If you want to have as close to an objective view as possible, you sample the data one way, then you sample the data another way, then you sample the data a third, a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh way. In this way, you can zero in on what's really there through multiple sensory input sources, and you can kind of crisscross validate what it is you see, what your observations are. And you can say, yeah, we also see it this way, yeah, we also see it that way. And that's what our multiple senses tell us. My ears are popping because I'm driving up into the mountains right now. I wonder if that'll have an impact on my voice. True, where your voice is coming from makes a difference. Whether you're Nebulon from Futurama or like a Woody Allen character. The issue is nasal versus from deep in your belly. They are different channeling. You are an instrument, right? You are a product of the material world, albeit a life process. An instance of a human instrument, I would call each of us. The manifest instance of a human instrument, because our DNA would be enough to give the general broad outlines of an instance of a human instrument. DNA kind of projects the electrical template, the ghost image of what most humans that could arise from this DNA would look like. It'd be like a cloud of probabilities around your height, around your presence or absence of gills and tails, right? Those would be extremely faded images in the overall image of all the potential use. Length of hair and fingernails would probably be a software controllable thing because those are controlled by deliberate choice. So the things that would be represented with blurred boundaries would be how bulky or thin you were, how tall or short you were. Whatever attributes could be impacted by diet and exercise, active or passive lifestyle. Intellectual pursuits, whether you've kept your mind occupied, expressions. So reality is probably a lot like that. There's probability clouds, calculatable. It's like, here are all, and you may have a dial moving back and forward in time. Here are all the most high probability appearances of an instance of a human coming from this original DNA. It wouldn't be able to tell you much about the human itself, except maybe in the broadest terms, maybe some temperaments. These are good questions. How much? With things like temperament also having these blurred boundaries of, behavior based on probability. Whether you're a generally pleasant or a generally miserable person, maybe, unless your misery came from particular events. But even then, people who are predisposed towards being miserable, I think, tend to externalize and say it's because of that event. Of course, there are lives so tragic where the events are so huge that you go, yeah, of course it's that. But then there's also Holocaust survivors who lead fairly, healthy lives as one would perceive them subjectively, because, anyone observing another's life, it's not an objective viewpoint, it's still subjective. The fact that so much is subjective in life, I believe that's even what led me down this thread, this tangent of conversation. Multiple viewpoints of a thing. Objectivity. Our existence here in this life, on this planet, under this system. It's all very interesting stuff. We seemed to be good instruments for pondering meaning and purpose. You ask, what is the meaning and purpose? What is the purpose of this instrument? Well, the purpose of this instrument is to ponder purpose. What do you mean by that? Well, whatever meaning you ascribe. It's almost impossible to imagine. When I say almost impossible, sci-fi does it all the time, but I should reframe that as try to imagine a context outside of human consciousness. There are certain ones which we can pop ourselves into, the head of maybe a gorilla or a cat. Other mammals that lean towards omnivorous generalists hard is it to imagine the existence of a lemur or a lemming? The stuff we came from, we can probably relate to. Look out for enemies, have some tribe or colony that you're a part of. Being a mammal. It's probably a very different experience than being other things that are more difficult to relate to because they are less like us. How can a discussion like this ever occur without the R word coming up, or the L word, reptilians and lizards? It is only natural for us to see reptiles and everything because, I don't know if we evolved directly from reptiles, but there is a number of interesting differences that differentiate us from some of our next closest, and some might say lower, on the evolutionary scale, cousins. Lower. Well, by their young mostly being born in eggs, there are plenty of reptiles whose young are born alive, so there are blurred lines of distinctions, and there are even mammals like platypuses and echidnas that lay eggs as opposed to giving birth to live children. So there are blurred lines of demarcation. However, on the whole, there's a smattering of social bond strengthening behaviors that come in being mammals that reptiles don't have. Except by smaller degrees at the extremes. Alligators take care of their young, with something that very much looks like motherly love. Mother's love for her children crosses between mammals and reptiles, but not universally through reptiles. There's also sea turtles who lay their eggs by the thousands with that insane marathon race for the hatchlings to reach the ocean safely before being picked off by countless predators. It's a foregone conclusion that the hatching of all these sea turtles is going to be a feast for all the local things that can eat such stuff. And only a percentage is going to get through. And that is the same animal who is used as its defense mechanism as it gets larger, a badass shield, so it doesn't have to run from predators. You just pull your arms and your legs and your head in to a shield that you carry around with you, and a predator can't eat you. It's amazing. It's an amazing protective adaptation. And you see it in other animals. The shell on the outside, was a come lately adaptation to reptiles, but it was the early, structural integrity to crabs and crustaceans and things that, on the insect and crustacean branch of the tree of life, they learned to wear their rigid materials on the outside as their bones and did away with the need for a vertebrae altogether, because reptiles are vertebrae animals. So a turtle, somewhat redundantly, has a backbone and that shell on the outside. Roly-poly bugs, lobsters, they all have that shell on the outside without a backbone. That shell is their structural integrity. Tendons on the inside and muscles on the inside can pull and move and animate that exoskeleton in whatever way it needs. The Iron Man suit is the living creature. Nature has that design. Like in the Iron Man comic books and movies, when the suits work on their own without a human on the inside, very insectoid there. So what kind of intelligences are you able to bring into existence in a jar? In a jar? Yeah, well, they're not mobile. You haven't given these neural networks legs to walk around on. They're in data centers, and you're not counting yourself limited by space. You let the data center run big, or you'll take up a large chunk of the data center to run the programs like deep learning that constitute sentience, certain parts of sentience. The alien parts of sentience. Potentially alien. Can giving something enough data take the place of it having first-hand, immersed in an environment experience? Being born. Well, for that matter, from the moment of conception, there's not really a consciousness as far as we understand it, but there is machinery working. There is life. There's no doubt that it's part of the process. It's an uninterrupted part of the process of life. Two living creatures bring into existence a third living creature that takes bundles of attributes from each parent in some random, mixing game of 22 chromosome pairs. Which each sperm and egg bring to the picture. So I guess each egg has it set on a monthly basis in a predetermined way. But the sperm is more of a random roll of the dice. It's which way they go through the fallopian tube, left and right, how fast they are, how many there are, how healthy and strong they are. And then I believe even the egg has a chance to reject certain ones and allow certain ones through, or maybe it's somewhere in there. There's a way that, a winner is chosen. It's not merely the fastest. There's new research showing that. So there's some process there which is just astounding. And then after that occurs, the fertilization occurs, and the choosing of the 22 winning chromosome pairs, that creates a probabilistic version of you. One that could be bet upon if it were a betting, universe. Different odds for different versions of you. And the more radical the extremes, like what did Einstein look like at that point? What did Hitler look like at that point? The extremes of probability, both in animal type it could turn out as, embittered, brilliant, determined, and the actual life it has, the instance of its life. If you include that as part of these probability clouds you're projecting, how much more in the probable infinite universes probabilistic, because they're not all so probable. The probability of these different realities occurring fades off as you go left and right. So what we're left with in the middle is the stuff that actually ended up being actualized. Actually. One of the biggest nerd words. But one of the biggest nerd words actually is aligned with one of the actual most important words, to actualize. Actualizing. Actualize. It's acting. To actualize is to act. To act is to carry out. Are we not all acting? Dramatic pause. I'm catching up on my Futuramas. Wow, Futurama is a thing. Thank you. It's so interesting how many things were things that were so much bigger than you realized growing up, and how every generation has a thing that is beloved to them that they look back to with rosy reminiscence, and a lot of their passion and dedication goes into holding on to, reliving, connecting with others associated with. It plays out in a lot of ways. But what I felt for the Amiga computer was felt for lots of different technologies growing up. Game platforms, a lot of Sega love. Sonic the Hedgehog is sort of an underground, community that's been, built up, let down, redeemed. Yeah, all kinds of story arcs to it. Much bigger than anything from I can't say from my generation, but from what I experienced. The stuff I, lived through involving the Amiga and the platform love and the betrayal and the redemption these days of Unix is, in my mind, every bit as epic as people falling in love with the Sonic the Hedgehog character. And being involved in the reanimating of it so that it is, universally, I don't even know the full breadth of the story. I'm sure there are still those who are disappointed with the fact that the pointy-toothed Sonic was so quickly abandoned. The artistic vision, the, pure story was so readily abandoned because of the pressure of the internet. All that creepypasta, uncanny divide stuff. Artistic artists who are too ready to listen to their audience and give up their artistic purity of design. But then I go admiring L. Frank Baum for listening to his readers and to give them exactly what they wanted. Wasn't it a truer and more deep channeling of what was important and statistically existed on average from across the readers? What about the Tin Woodman? Was he really a robot? Well, no, let me show you what a robot really looks like. There is a difference between an artificially created being in the form of TikTok, who shows up not too far in. I believe that's the third book of Oz, the first being The Wizard of Oz, the second being, I forget, but it's the one in which Jack Pumpkinhead and Ozma of Oz are introduced. I was quite surprised by it. It was a very good lesson in broadening your context and having an open mind. I jumped to the wrong book at that time with my kid. thinking you could read these things out of order. You could not. I guess it's conceivable that you could, but the Wizard of Oz stories are written in a very sequential story arc. And the second book was the geopolitical one. It was Oz's version of Dune, setting up the politics of the world so that you understand what happens on Dorothy's eventual return, which is the third book, I believe called Return to Oz. I should get these names down. I'm thinking I'll probably even read them. One of the things the world needs desperately is a reread of the Oz storybooks. Much of what's going on with the world today was channeled by L. Frank Baum and turned into children's stories 100 years earlier. Found its way into the movies, at least enough to provide familiarity, indoctrination, introduction. What would The Wizard of Oz be today without the MGM movie from the 1930s? What would Alice in Wonderland be today without the familiarity provided by Disney, Walt Disney? So two of the most important coming-of-age stories were catapulted back into the public attention through the rise of media, and through the selection of original story matter. The process of selecting original story matter inevitably leads you to great stories. The selection process might have a little bit to discuss there, because what else like Alice in Wonderland or The Wizard of Oz actually did exist? What was out there and was not selected, was not blessed or taken up as the, universally beloved, or at least well-known, sometimes controversial, those two stories. One from the British perspective, the other from the American perspective. The concept of magic keeps reoccurring. One might say that magic played such a prevalent role in all these fantasy stories because the notion of wrapping it in a scientific context was not realistic. It had less credibility to it than saying it was because of fairies and magic. There's at least a history of the readiness to believe in fairies and magic. So things like J.R. Tolkien's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings all the stories like it that have predisposed the world towards kind of a reaccepting of magic. In place of Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew mysteries, we have Harry Potter. I might also say in place of Danny Dunn, because that was my early science adventure books, which introduced, invisibility in terms of a dragonfly drone, right? So I was reading about dragonfly drones. I must have been, it was before I was 12, because 11 to 12 is when I started discovering Lord Fowle's Bane, the Thomas Covenant series, and J.R. Tolkien. So fantasy. I went the fantasy direction first. But before I went the fantasy direction in sort of the adult books, I had gone the science direction in, kid reader books. And so Danny Dunn was my Hardy Boys Mysteries, or my Nancy Drew, because it had the science aspect to it. And science in those days, Firefly drones with full telemetry so that you could be an invisible person. That was the 1970s. That was sci-fi reaching kids readers. In the 70s, that's before I was 11, I was reading for pleasure those types of books. My kid is into manga, and I am very thankful for that. Comic books are a good transition media. I got into my comic book phase after I got into my sci-fi and fantasy book reading phase. So I read, those inch-thick sci-fi books from like 11 years old, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, probably up until I was 17 or 18, a good 5 or 6 years of sci-fi reading. It wasn't that many books. It was challenging. But then I discovered comics, and I really got into comics. I loved the visual aspect of it. So from like 17 years old to maybe like 22 or something, up until around when my dad died. I read comics up until around when my dad died. Graduating college. 1992. Wow, was 1991 and 92 big years. People attribute the technology explosion, the rise of the digital information age, to the internet and the web. And the web was upon us in 1996, when desktop computers were powerful enough to host a decent web browser. You know what made the average home computer powerful enough for Netscape Navigator? Video games. The 3D engines of 91 and 92. The PC's determination, I guess through vendors and third-party channels, to become the new gaming platform. The need to sort of make the game platform on PC clones as a race with and against the game platforms like Nintendo's and Sony's PlayStation. So it was a battle of who the gaming industry money was going to go to. Microsoft got behind the PC platform sufficiently to make the Xbox, and then I believe they gave up the PC architecture. The x86s went away, briefly in the Xbox and replaced by the cell architecture, the PowerPC lineage, ironically enough, right? It's amazing, astounding to me that the Xbox went this other hardware platform direction. But I guess less is religion to Microsoft than you might think. Given how it embraced Unix in the early days by creating Xenix. Now, embraced is maybe too generous of a word. And I'll have to wrap up this video soon because I'm going to be where I'm needing to go soon. Life is funny. Keep on keeping on. You continue with your forward momentum. When forward momentum is lost, you use those tricks that you've acquired over life to re-spark and reinitiate your forward momentum. Stalling out is possible. Depression is possible. Slumps, spirals in the wrong direction, all part of the human experience. Also, all things you can rise above. You navigate your own life. Overcome the odds through determination and human free will, something that comes into existence in human instruments at a more frequent rate than it does in other animals, no matter how much intelligence you attribute to them. There is something about mammals. There's something about hierarchy that resembles classism that makes humans strive. There is a differentness that sets into humans that comes about as a result of their culture, their social programming, their history, their personal background, their language, their tools that they've taken up in life. And all these things matter. They matter in shaping you. They matter in putting those final details onto which of the actualized projections of probabilistic entities is going to be you. What unlikely path is followed through the cloud of probabilities that lead to the one unique you that's here listening to me right now. It's really a rather odd and amazing thing that you're here, that I'm here, that you're here, that the two of us are at least here, and together we start to move one step from subjectivity and, solipsistic, the world exists for you, so that this experience, I'm not saying that this is true, but many lines of thinking lead to solipsism, which is basically that, if the world is some holographic projection created by consciousness, it's by you and for you, and so nothing really matters. A lot of these worldviews, the punchline at the end is, so nothing really matters. So there's two things wrong with that. First, you cannot prove that solipsism exists any better than you can prove that solipsism doesn't exist. And given the extreme unpredictability of other actors and players in your reality, there is a high probability that there's a driving force of awareness behind them, similar to the one that's behind you, and so that we can at least start to believe that there are other actors and players in existence other than us. It's still a human-centric type view of the world, granted. but it's harder to deny an image of another human as a holographic projection as it would be, say, a tree and a river and the world around you in general. No matter how much alive, insects and animals and plants and trees might all be, it's still a step too easy to say, oh, this is the playing back of some serene holodeck tape. But as soon as you start interacting with other players, it is much harder to say that because they seem so much like you. We know from our dreams that's really not a problem for our brains to fill in that either. So who knows? But over time, there's enough evidence that, okay, at least we're probably in a community universe. There are others like us here. We're in a shared space of some sort. And that probably is a good starting point because, we're in a shared space. The randomness of conception creates that initial hardware. That initial hardware either defines a lot of those probabilistic projections of who we might become, or it works as a gateway in, an antenna for I forget whether that was my turn. No, I think it's the next one coming up. And so I will be wrapping up. It's almost an hour. And so do not forget that you control a lot about who you are, based on your decisions, based on your stick-to-itiveness, and your rising up above the situations. Yeah, no, I'm doing this right. So keep tending to things. Have a certain maintenance mode that goes on automatically in the background all the time. Push more and more over to that automatic maintenance mode so you don't have to think about all the stuff that so many people would categorize as the suffering of life. Try and get as much of that taken care of kind of automatically as possible through your own actions and things you can feel good about it. If you do it through loopholes and cheating, you might get away with survival, but you won't necessarily feel good about it. So survive because you be you. I would argue that carpentry skills are the best thing there. For you to be you, find tools that incorporate readily into you and are usable in a broad range of contexts that better your life in a broad range of ways. Oh no, I am doing this wrong. I am going to a different location than the one I thought I was. So I am turning around here. And I am going to determine to not screw up on this drive, which I haven't done in a while. So I'm probably going to wrap it up there because it is a decent place to wrap this up. It's not even 8 a.m. in the morning. I'm going to get these errands done with, and I'm going to continue my day, which could go in any number of infinite directions. There's a lot of possibility here, and we'll see what it is, and I'll fill you in on that on the next video. Thanks for joining me. Hope to see you again soon, and don't forget to subscribe.